Good afternoon and welcome to our next panel, which is about the $1 million question, whether Europe can survive without Russia, without Russian natural gas. And we're facing some painful policy choices after Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The question is, which is Europe's energy transition strategy without Russia? What about the prices? Will war fast-track the energy transition? We will try to approach the issue to give some answers, if possible, with the help of Nick Redman, Editor-in-Chief and Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica. Mr. Redman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fintikakis, and thank you everyone also for coming here. I know you have a lot of competition, a lot of choices in this forum, so thank you for choosing this session. When I was thinking how to answer the question that lies before us, I couldn't help but think of the story of the American tourist going back to Ireland to try and find the small village where his ancestors came from. He looked and looked, he got completely lost, of course, because he was a man, he didn't really want to ask for directions. And eventually he fell on a local and said, please help me, I'm completely lost, I'm trying to get to this place. And the local thought for a minute and scratched his head, and then he said, well, if I was trying to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And when we look at the situation that Europe is in, trying to transition away from Russian gas in the context of greening the overall economy, and given the decisions that have been made over several decades, here is not a good place to start. I'm going to focus my remarks mainly on gas rather than oil or coal, because this is the most difficult fuel to replace in the mix. And I'll be talking about the EU at the level of the 27 member states. And this is despite the fact there are huge differences regarding their consumption of gas overall levels, their uses of gas, their level of domestic output, their import options, and their short-term alternatives. So one size is never going to fit all on this. So in the past 20 years, Europe has used gas to do two things really, and the power mix in terms of its change. Firstly, to replace coal, also to retire some of its nuclear energy within the mix. Now, only 2 months ago, the Belgian government was still looking to replace its last 2 nuclear reactors with 2 large gas turbines, even though this would increase their carbon emissions in net term. So with indigenous gas production in secular decline, Russia has assumed the role of being an anchoring supplier of gas as one of the vital transition fuels for Europe. Now, this reliance extends well beyond the power sector. As we know, it's also in industry, it's also gas within the building sector, and these are 3 of the 5 major sectors that contribute to most of the carbon emissions that have to be tackled under Fit for 55. So we have punishing targets already and a difficult juggling act. Have to radically restructure whole economies, not just the power sector, without bankrupting companies, without bankrupting individuals, without doing serious damage to living standards, and while remaining globally competitive. And now all these balls that we have to juggle, there's another one which is trying to get off Russian gas as soon as possible. As far as we can tell, this Russian gas is still going to be available to Europe, which is the big question Vladimir Putin potentially cutting off. Putin's demand to be paid in rubles was most likely, I believe, an effort to force Europeans to punch a hole in their own system of financial sanctions, rather than as a pretext for cutting off supply. We'll find out the answer to that shortly, but that seems to be the case. However, important to note that by making this order to Gazprom, Putin has put his principal gas company in a very difficult position. It cannot unilaterally change the terms of these long-term supply contracts. Such changes must be negotiated, and the other party has a vote. The other party can say no, the other party can demand things in return. This might not work to Gazprom and Putin's advantage. If Gazprom is to be paid in rubles, but the price of agreeing that change in the contract is to cut the contractual term from 10 years to 5 years, is Gazprom really better off in that situation? Remember that this is a company whose business model is first you sell the gas and then you produce the gas. It's a long-term business model. It's essential to it that this could really damage. Now, of course, contracts bind both parties. Some EU companies might find themselves dragged to arbitration tribunals in Stockholm or other cities around the world by Gazprom if they move too far, too fast on reducing their Russian energy consumption. It's important to note, I think, that of the 155 billion cubic meters of gas that Europe consumed from Russia last year, there's only about 15 billion cubic meters which is due to expire under those contracts this year, 2022. And indeed, it's only 40 billion to the rest of this decade. So the contractual commitment is still 100 billion cubic meters, even at the point of 2030. Let's turn to the really big question. How far can we cut? How deep? How quick? The Commission has proposed a mix of measures to deliver a 2/3 cut in just the space of 1 year, so to cut 100 billion cubic meters off. It's a mix of securing alternative gas supplies, finding other ways to generate power, and cutting consumption through efficiency measures. The International Energy Agency, which went a few days before the Commission, has proposed similar measures, but it sees 50 billion as a more realistic level of cut for the first year. Now, when you compare the two, I have to say, to me, the IEA numbers look much more plausible on the volume of LNG that will be available and on the possibility to ramp up beyond existing plans, which are already strong, wind and solar generation. That's in light of the supply constraints we see globally. Let's assume that the EU will press ahead with a rapid downsizing of its Russian gas purchases. I leave open the question of how it's going to do that, what the role of legislation might be, or anything else. Let's assume also that Russian volumes are going to be available in sufficient quantities for as long as they need. Now, that might be an unsafe assumption, but we've got to make some at this point. On the supply side, I think an extra 30 billion cubic meters of gas beyond what we're already contracted for next year is perfectly possible. 10 billion or so from pipeline, 20 billion from LNG. Ramping up wind and solar can certainly happen, but the existing goals were already challenging, and the EU was struggling to meet them. Simply increasing the goal doesn't actually get you any closer to achieving it. What can be made, so I'm doubtful in the very short term, in a year or two, we can make a huge difference on that. And if we did, maybe it's going to be a case of taking from some of the capacity that we had planned for the next 2 years to bring it forward to this year, but then you're shorter later down the line, 2-3 years down the line. Beyond demand management then, which I think is possible, what else might we see? I think full use of existing nuclear capacity, some of which was offline for maintenance last year, some of which had just been decommissioned, some of which is due to be decommissioned this year, might actually now continue to run. The 2 Belgian nuclear power plants that I mentioned 5 minutes ago, they've now been given a stay of execution. They won't be shutting in 2025, they'll be shutting in 2035. In Germany, you've got 3 reactors that were taken offline last year, but could still be put back on. You've got another 3 that are due to be taken back offline this year. They could continue. One of the themes of this conference has been thinking the unthinkable. It seemed unthinkable 6 weeks ago that the Green Party in coalition government in Germany would opt to keep nuclear power on, but it's something that we have to consider as a possibility today. Much more gas can be saved if Europe makes full use of its biomass capacity. That's at roughly 50% of the current level. And although burning wood waste is not universally popular as an option, and there are growing challenges to the arithmetic around which it is considered to be carbon neutral. Efforts to reverse the decline of indigenous gas production, I think, are also possible in some cases. If I may use an example beyond the EU, Shell's recent decision to look again at an offshore North Sea block that the UK government is tendering for, I think is very interesting. They'd got the signal that that was a business to leave, but now they're wondering if they should go back. And remember that once Shell, BP, Equinor, and other Western companies have wrapped up their businesses in Russia, which they're doing right now, they're going to have engineers with a lot of time on their hands. Think also, in some European countries, actually this could be another moment to look at fracking. I know it's unpopular, I know it's dirty, but the short-term timelines for fracking work for this particular environment we're in. And I think what I should have said headline is, in this situation, every alternative, every option has to be explored in order to make sense of this situation we're in. And finally, I think we should expect lots of export deals with the suppliers in Australia, in North America, in Africa, and the Middle East. I think Germany's recent deal with Qatar for a long-term supply deal, and also for building 2 LNG import terminals, finally, is likely to be the first of many. However, when you look at all the big projects that are in train in the world, and when you knock out the Russian one within it, it looks to me more like this is a 2024, 25, 26, rather than 2022, 23, 24 situation, that you're really going to see those volumes actually coming into Europe. What follows from all this? Let me conclude with 4 things. I know we're short on time. First, big government, which we saw during the pandemic, is here to stay and may even be getting bigger. The state is going to have to play an active role in ensuring that the infrastructure is changed dramatically and rapidly. It's going to have to backstop the construction of LNG terminals. It's going to have to build many more pipelines to connect European states better. Right now we have a situation that far too much LNG import capacity within the Union is stuffed on the Atlantic seaboard, or close to it. We're going to need more power line upgrades. There's going to have to be a lot more electricity trading, I think, within the Union. And we need to promote energy efficiency measures. You cannot leave all these things to the market. Government, whether it's at the EU level or member state level, is going to have to play a role here. The market did not do a good job of delivering supply security, and I don't think you can rely on it to do everything here. Second, as a result of the downgrading of Russia, the deliberate move to away from Russia, I think we are more dependent now on some bets coming off in a relatively shorter time space. I'm thinking here particularly of battery storage, but also some of the more advanced forms of carbon capture or even carbon removal directly from the air. Third, if those bets and some other bets in terms of the supply mix don't come off, I think the timeline for electrifying transport, that's the second sector within the mix that really has to go green, that looks very demanding, I think. To meet electricity demand with little or no Russian gas today is difficult enough from our starting position. To then significantly increase, maybe even double electricity output, so you can also power every car and every truck that is currently running on petrol and diesel, it's a really big ask. Finally, I think the reliance on gas from other sources, and particularly a dash to hydrogen for industry at scale, which is a really interesting subject of our previous panel, I think this risks landing Europe with a new set of dependencies. And by the way, I include the UK in this. This is not this is not me making any partisan statements, not at all. In the case of gas, especially if the LNG market disappoints, it is Norway, Azerbaijan, Libya, and Algeria that could well be the key suppliers. Mm-hmm. Now, of those 4 states, one has sclerotic politics, a sclerotic economy, and lots of mouths to feed. Not necessarily the most stable place. One has 2 prime ministers, 2 governments, 2 parliaments, a Turkish military base, Russian mercenaries, lots of warlords, and the European Union divided over which side they hope is going to win. And civil war very easily reignite. And finally, another one is a bordering state to Russia. I'm not with a one-party state, so I'm not talking about Norway here. I'm talking about Azerbaijan, a former Soviet state. How Vladimir Putin will respond to Ilham Aliyev taking some of his market share in the European gas market is probably the subject for an entire other presentation discussion, but I'll leave you at that point.
Right.
Thank you.
So here's a question. What you're saying is that the Russian gas cutoff is possible, but not probable. I mean, that Putin's demand for payment in rubles is a problem for Gazprom, but existing contracts tie Europe too, right?
I think they do, and that's why it's going to be really interesting to see exactly what happens in terms of government legislation.
So, do you see lots of litigation?
I think there's lots. I think this is obviously this crisis already has been brilliant for the lawyers, right? Because sanctions loopholes have just gone through the roof, and I think there's going to be lots of work for the lawyers. I think it really depends how this is managed, how the Russians choose to take it. Is Putin at some point going to say, "Okay, I'm done with you. I'm going to do a deal with China," which he will get very bad terms from, even worse terms than when he did the deal in 2014. Which was the first big Russian-Chinese supply deal. They'd been at loggerheads for 3 years, and then all of a sudden Putin goes to Beijing and they have a deal. We don't know the terms, but every ounce of logic tells you that it was Putin that folded because he'd been internationally sanctioned and he couldn't afford to leave Beijing without that deal that said to the world, I've got alternatives.
Okay, I see. Another thing, you mentioned, and let me ask you, how do you explain that compared to International Energy Agency, the IEA, the Commission proposal looks too optimistic on LNG? What's your take on that? How do you explain that?
It's a short term, but the problem is that the LNG market is very tight, right? I mean, few factors on demand and supply. Demand, China, although it's still building new coal plants, is still trying to buy gas and actually transfer some of its coal plants to LNG. So you've got a really big buyer right there that's in the market that wasn't really there 10 years ago. Second, the industry as a whole did insufficient investment 2014 to 2018. So there's a lag to this. And a lot of the existing output is already tied up. It's in long-term contracts. Maybe Qatar can
US
find a few
terminals
volumes.
already running at capacity.
US is the only one that really has the sufficient capacity to ramp up. But the US volumes that we're talking about don't actually hit it. Now, as I say, a few cargoes from somewhere like Qatar can be reallocated, but they've got long-term contracts with Asian buyers that are quite difficult to break. So Qatar is really looking at 2024, 2025, when they would love to sit down with as many Europeans as possible and conclude long-term deals.
So what happens actually is that we will see a relocation of supply to Europe, from Asia to Europe, right?
I think you'll probably see more Middle Eastern gas coming here.
Another thing, diversification or decarbonization. I mean, there's this question of energy independence that remains divided between two camps. First, should self-sufficiency come from other local or friendly gas, or even nuclear sources, as you mentioned, meaning diversification, or through more ambitious energy independence achieved via local clean energy supplies, such as wind and solar power, means decarbonization. Which of two? Where are we right now?
Well, I think
or both.
Yeah, I think it's easier to go down the decarbon route if you've still got Russian energy in the mix for the next few years. I think the problem of shifting to other suppliers is you actually might find it's more difficult to shorten the end date by which you're cutting out gas. I mean, you're not going to be able to do it like a 2-3 year question. Say a 2-3 year deal with Qatar in quite the same way. On the energy independence side, I think it's worth saying nuclear is part of that. I mean, that would deliver quite a high degree of independence, but I think there's a paradox. As I said, existing nuclear, I think, has probably got an extra shot of life here. But I wonder if longer term, new build nuclear actually is set back by this, if only from the planning perspective. If you're thinking about replacing a gas plant with a nuclear plant, and you've got 8 years of operation of that gas plant to go, it's fine. You have the time then to build, to plan, to deliver your nuclear plant. But if you've only got that gas plant for another 3 years because your supply is running short, you can't deliver a nuclear plant readily in that time. So I wonder if from a timing perspective, ironically, we're seeing, can I say a paradox? A paradox between short-term viability for nuclear, but then longer term, I think in some cases it could prove quite difficult. Obviously not in France.
Last question. Do we have the means to fast-track renewables expansion? I mean, at the moment, Germany, as well as many European countries, such as Greece, are reliant on Russia for both oil and at least 45–50% of gas.
So I think renewables, wind, solar, is definitely the future. It's just a question of how far, how fast Europe can move. As I said, there's real constraints in the supply chain right now. But Europe has excellent incentives to do so. There is a lot of engineering smarts here. It should be very easy to mobilize the capital. Let's see how far and fast we can go. It's just a little bit of a pity that we're being obliged to move quite as quickly.
Okay. To sum up, I would note that Russian gas cutoff is possible but not probable. That compared to the IEA, the Commission proposal looks unduly optimistic. And moreover, it seems that alternative gas supply will be part of the answer, as will existing nuclear, biomass, and some coal. Okay, thanks for watching.
Thank you.